You pull a trigger. A tiny piece of metal flies faster than sound and stops a life in an instant. You barely think about what's happening inside that mechanism. But the real answer is far stranger than a simple tool. It starts with monks looking for eternal life and ends with an accident that changed how humans kill each other forever. Your brain is wired for throwing. Long before spears, before arrows, before anything you'd call a weapon, your ancestors were hurling rocks at rivals and predators. Anthropologists believe this throwing ability, powered by a uniquely flexible shoulder joint, gave early humans a survival edge no other primate had. Chimpanzees can throw, but they throw poorly, without accuracy, without real power behind the motion. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, a small change in shoulder anatomy turned a clumsy gesture into a weapon. You could kill from a distance. You didn't have to get close enough to be killed yourself. That single idea, distance equals safety, never left the human mind. It just kept finding new machines to live inside. Think about what that really meant for a small group of early humans facing a predator twice their size. Claws and teeth require proximity. A thrown rock does not. For the first time, a smaller, weaker body could defeat a larger, stronger one, as long as the smaller body struck first and struck from far enough away. This wasn't just a hunting advantage. It reorganized the entire logic of conflict between humans too. Whoever controlled distance controlled the fight. Consider the spear. Then the atlatl, a lever that let a hunter throw a dart harder and farther than an arm alone ever could. Then the bow, which stored energy in bent wood and released it in a fraction of a second. Each invention did the same thing. It pushed the moment of danger further away from the person holding the weapon. Why does this pattern matter? Because it tells you guns were never a single invention. They were the last step in a very long staircase. Now, travel to China, around the 9th century. Taoist alchemists were not trying to build a weapon. They were trying to build immortality. They mixed sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, hoping to create an elixir that would let an emperor live forever. Instead, they created something that burned violently and sometimes exploded. Early Chinese texts actually warned alchemists against combining these ingredients, describing burned hands and scorched huts. You could call it history's first recorded lab accident. Nobody set out to invent gunpowder. They stumbled into it while chasing something completely different. The historian Joseph Needham, who spent decades documenting Chinese scientific history, traced this discovery through old alchemical texts and showed how gunpowder moved slowly from a curiosity into a tool of war. At first, it wasn't even used for weapons. It was used for fireworks, for signaling, for scaring off evil spirits during festivals. The explosive power was there, but nobody had connected it yet to killing at a distance. That connection took centuries. Picture the alchemists themselves for a moment. Not soldiers, not engineers. Men in quiet rooms, grinding minerals, mixing formulas, chasing a goal that had nothing to do with warfare. They wanted to stop death, not cause it. There's something almost tragic about that. The very substance meant to extend life became, within a few generations, the substance most efficient at ending it. You could call this irony. Historians tend to call it a pattern. Powerful new materials rarely stay in the hands of the people who first discover them, and they rarely get used the way their discoverers intended. Here's the twist you probably never considered. Gunpowder existed for hundreds of years before anyone built a gun. Chinese armies used it in fire arrows, in early bombs, in devices that sprayed flame like a dragon's breath. But turning an explosion into a directed, aimed projectile required a different kind of thinking. It required someone to ask a very specific question. What if the explosion pushed something forward instead of outward in every direction? That answer arrived gradually, through bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder and a projectile, early ancestors of what we'd now call a gun. By the 13th century, metal barrels replaced bamboo. The device could survive more pressure. It could fire something heavier and more lethal. The historian Kenneth Chase, in his study of firearms across cultures, argued that the design of early guns wasn't just about better metal or more powder, it was shaped by geography. Societies fighting nomadic cavalry on open plains developed firearms differently than societies fighting behind city walls. Your ancestors' weapons weren't invented in a vacuum. They were built to answer the specific threats right outside their door. You might assume guns spread quickly once they existed. They didn't. For a long time, early firearms were slow, unreliable, and honestly worse than a skilled archer. A trained bowman could fire 6 arrows in the time it took a gunner to reload once. So why did guns eventually win? Not because they were more accurate, not because they were faster. They won because they were easier to teach. Think about what it actually costs to train a master archer. Years of practice, immense upper body strength, a childhood spent building muscle memory that could never be rushed. English longbowmen, for example, often began training as children, and skeletal remains of medieval archers show visible bone deformities from decades of drawing heavy bows. That is the price of true mastery. A gun demanded almost none of that. You could take someone off a farm, hand them a musket, and in weeks, not years, they could stand in a battle line and fire a lethal shot. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Guns didn't win because they made individual soldiers more deadly. They won because they made deadliness cheap. They democratized violence. And once violence becomes cheap, everything built on top of the old, expensive version of violence starts to crack. Nobility across the world had spent centuries justifying their power, partly through martial skill, the idea that certain families simply produced better warriors. Guns quietly dissolved that justification. A peasant with 2 weeks of training could now kill a knight who had trained since childhood. The battlefield stopped rewarding a lifetime of preparation and started rewarding whoever could put the most gunpowder into the most hands. The military historian Peter Purton, studying medieval warfare, noted how this shift reorganized entire societies. Armies stopped depending on a small elite class of warriors who trained for a lifetime. Instead, they depended on numbers, on gunpowder, and on the ability to mass-produce something ordinary people could use with minimal instruction. Power stopped belonging only to those born into it, or those who had decades to master a bow. Power became something you could manufacture. Does that sound familiar? It should. You are living inside a much later version of the exact same pattern. Every technology that reduces the skill required to cause harm or to gain influence follows this same arc. It starts rare, expensive, and hard to use. It ends common, cheap, and available to almost anyone. Firearms did this to warfare. You've likely watched other tools do the same thing to entirely different parts of life. There's something else worth sitting with. The cognitive scientist Stephen Mithen has written about how early human innovation wasn't purely practical. It was deeply connected to imagination, to the ability to combine ideas from separate domains, alchemy and mechanics, ritual and engineering, into something new. The gun wasn't invented by a single genius sketching a blueprint. It was assembled slowly by people solving unrelated problems whose solutions eventually collided. Immortality-seeking monks, metalworkers improving armor, engineers designing siege weapons, none of them were trying to invent the gun. The gun found them. By the time firearms reached Europe in the 14th century, they spread with startling speed. Cannons cracked open castle walls that had stood for centuries. The entire logic of medieval defense, thick stone, high towers, a moat, collapsed within a few generations. A fortress that had protected a family for 300 years could now be breached in an afternoon. Power that once came from land and lineage started shifting toward whoever controlled gunpowder and could afford to buy it in bulk. This shift didn't stay contained to castles. It reached all the way into how nations were built. Rulers who wanted to compete now needed foundries, metalworkers, and steady supplies of saltpeter. Warfare stopped being something a noble family could fund alone from its own land. It became something that required an entire economy behind it. Mines, trade routes, taxation systems built specifically to keep armies supplied with powder and shot. Some historians argue this pressure helped push medieval kingdoms toward the centralized, bureaucratic states that eventually became modern nations. A weapon born from a search for immortality ended up reshaping how human societies organized themselves at the largest possible scale. You should ask yourself why this story rarely gets told this way. Most explanations skip straight to gunpowder was invented in China and spread to Europe, as if it were a single clean event, an arrow moving from point A to point B. The truth is messier and far more human. It's a story about accidents, about people trying to cheat death and instead learning how to deliver it faster, about slow, unglamorous decades where an explosive curiosity sat mostly unused, until someone finally asked what would happen if you pointed it at another person. Here's the part that connects all the way back to you, standing in a modern room holding a piece of engineered metal that would have seemed impossible to that alchemist scorching his own hands centuries ago. Every weapon you've ever seen, every argument about safety, every debate you've overheard about who should be allowed to hold this kind of power, traces back to that same original impulse your ancestors had when they first threw a rock instead of using their fists. Keep the danger far away from your own body. Let the tool absorb the risk instead of you. That impulse never changed, only the distance kept growing, from a fist to a thrown stone to an arrow to a musket ball to whatever sits in a locked case somewhere in your world right now. Each generation convinced itself its weapon was the final step, the most advanced version humanity would ever need. Each generation was wrong. So when you pull a trigger, or even just watch one pulled on a screen, you're not looking at a modern invention. You're watching the newest chapter in a story that started with monks chasing eternal life and ended up teaching the human species how to end it instead.